And someone says, well, they still have their annual banquet in the Tiptoe Inn on Broadway. You go up there, have some chicken and green peas and chicken soup. That sounds good to me. So I went to the Tiptoe Inn that year, 1963. I felt a little awkward because here I was, a square-looking fellow wearing a suit and a tie with a briefcase, looking like any other FBI agent, perhaps. How will they trust me? Would they talk to me? You know, these were militants, revolutionaries. What sort of people are there? And I entered this room where they were making speeches and there were songs, and they saw me come in. And I was absolutely enthralled by these people. And 15 years later, my opinion hasn't changed, not one whit.
I'm a man of peace, and that's why I'm an anarchist. It may sound very, very contradictory, but this is the fact. Anarchism is a peace movement.
I think my ideas were all my life. It wasn't that I had to read about it, but I was naturally believing in freedom and not to impose and not to dictate anybody.
Everybody was molding a little bit the younger generation, and that's how it became with that. I was never a communist, and I was never anything else but an anarchist.
Oh, Ellis Island, du Grenetz von Freiland, wie grausam, wie schrecklich du bist. A selche Retziches, was kennen nur Riches, du plockst die Geplockte siehst. Mit Zorres gekommen, dem Jam durchgeschwommen, die Götten von Freiheit der Sehn. Und kommt Ellis Island, Grenetz von Freiland, und sagt halt, man kann weiter nicht gehen.
The Jews who had come out of Eastern Europe or who were still living in Europe were not only a religious group, but were a nation. And they were treated as a nationality group with a lot of prejudice against them, but treated as a nationality group. And the Jews, like Frenchmen or Germans or Italians or Spaniards, became anarchists. A certain number of them did, so that they were known as Jewish anarchists, just as there are Spanish anarchists or Italian anarchists, but not because they were religious anarchists.
I come from a Hasidic family, and I was a believer in the Jewish religion, in the very strict Orthodox religion. But I had my doubts, apparently, since my early childhood. And when I finally freed myself of the religious dogma, I still remained a Jew. I still consider myself as a Jew, but a secular Jew. And I consider myself an anarchist because I believe in the attainability of a system of society without government.
Anarchism in the 1880s and 1890s was probably the largest radical movement among the Jewish immigrants. These immigrants actually were upset by the world that confronted them when they arrived in the United States. They were disappointed. For some, of course, it's the legendary streets paved with gold, which they failed to find. I don't think any of the anarchist working men were anticipating anything like that. But they could not foresee the wrenching experience that they underwent from one world to the other. Oscar Handlin, the Harvard historian, wrote a famous book called The Uprooted. And they were uprooted from one land, one culture, one world, and cast into another world where conditions of labor were, if anything, worse than they had found, and more rigorous and more demanding than they had been in the old country. And the sweatshops were no better than the factories in Lodz or Bialystok, for example, from which many of them had come. And they were revolted by the entire ethic of capitalism that they found here in the United States, in New York, in Baltimore, and Boston, Philadelphia, and other large cities where they tended to settle, in addition to the Lower East Side. So what they did was to replace this world with a counter-world, American culture with a counterculture, and they began to establish their whole anarchist culture, an anarchist milieu.
On July the 4th, 1890, they started with the Freie Arbeiterstimme. The paper, from its very inception, was an economic paper, an anarchist paper, spreading the ideas of a society without government, without coercion, without force, without wars. The immediate task of forming unions to help to relieve the economic situation of this sweatshop worker, and at the same time helping develop Yiddish culture, Yiddish theater, Yiddish poetry, Yiddish literature. And it went on like this till the end of 1977. After 87 and a half years, the Freie Arbeiterstimme had to cease publication.
Now here is the guy that we were waiting for. So this is our secretary. Let me introduce him first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why doesn't he come out?
Come here. Because, you know,
I
we
don't want to be a secretary.
No.
I was the anarchist, you know, who liked
Now wait a
titles,
minute.
you know.
We are in a hurry. They may shut off the electricity from now between 3 o'clock.
They will.
Yeah, anytime.
So what
Okay.
purpose is all
He is
this?
the secretary of the managing committee of the Freie Arbeiterstimme. Now, aside from this, he is a retired master mariner. He helped us win the Second World War by convoying help and material in ships to Murmansk. He also did another
Who's
thing.
got a cigarette?
He
Nobody has a bloody
no.
cigarette.
He also helped break through the British blockade around Palestine and smuggle illegal immigrants to Israel. Now tell him.
Palestine. There was no Israel there. There was Palestine.
Well, actually, we're here filming the closing in the Freie Arbeiterstimme. So we were talking about its early days. I was wondering what's the circulation now as compared to when
I
it
don't
first
know
went.
exactly what a circulation is.
Don't you read the Freie Arbeiterstimme? It's 1700. The last circulation was 1700.
Yeah.
By the way, you have these points there in the, oh, you want it here. Yeah, it's 1700. But it was not sufficient enough because we only charged $7 a year. And the expenses for printing and mailing are twice as much. And we couldn't charge more because many of our readers couldn't afford to pay more. So this is the reason
My
why...
observation is this, you know, there was all kinds of libertarian, there were anarchist publications, Italian, Spanish, other languages. But they gave up, you know, they gave up the shit. The Jews are a stubborn lot, you know. See, so they kept it going, you know, now finally the language is passing away, so that's my observation. I think I'm right.
Is this a sad day for you?
Huh?
Is this a sad day for you, the closing?
It's not a sad day, you know. You look at all these books, you know, how idealistic they were to put the books out, the gospel, what you might call, you know. And it's a different age you live in.
You think, are those ideas still important to you? Do you think they're as
Yeah,
realistic as when you...
The idea, those ideas have been going on God knows how long, you know. Don't take me to say God knows that I believe there is a big boss with long beard and sidelocks, you know. What do you want from me?
Don't walk because she has to walk away from you.
But are you still as idealistic as you were when you first read the Freie Arbeiterstimme?
You have to be idealistic, otherwise you might as well take a gun and blow your brains out, you know.
Nicht such mich, wo die Myrten grünen, gefindest mich dort nicht, mein Schatz. Die Lebenswelten bei Maschinen, dort ist ein Ruheplatz. Dort Schatz, als Klaff wie Nil, wie Keiten klingen, dort ist mein Ruheplatz, dort ist mein
Wait a minute.
That's all right. That's
You
a
were
good
working
start.
already.
That's a good start. That was
You're
very
not
nice
supposed to
start.
work so early. It's not 12 o'clock yet.
Where's old man?
He didn't feel well. He was ready to go, and in the last minute he says, I don't feel well.
He sounded sort
You know,
of
who
lovely when I called him.
And Paul Avich is going to be here before 1 o'clock. He couldn't make it earlier. So we'll have to wait a little for him.
The Jewish anarchists, besides starting the Feierabendstimme, were very much interested in other things. They were very much for cooperatives, for building cooperatives, for the unions. They were very active in the unions. The first anarchists that I believe were leaders of the leaders. As a matter of fact, we had even one that was the president, who was of the ILGW, who was an anarchist. And therefore, we were able to exist because we were interested in labor unions, we were interested in cooperatives, and we were very active there.
And we expressing ourselves in the Freie Arbeitsstimme was our paper that we could propagate with it. That's what the important thing is, why. And naturally, if I could sell the paper, it was propaganda.
My early youth, I hung on the fringe of the communists, and when I saw a few of their deals personally, I said, not for me. And then through another friend, I came to these people, and I was with them all the time, ever since, and that was in my 20s. I've been with them a good 50 years. Their philosophy, their thinking, their dealing, one with the other, their concern for each other. There's at least a little thread of humanity, not for the purpose of what's dictated from above.
Anarchism is a philosophy which rejects all forms of government. It's the only radical movement, communism, socialism, although the communists and socialists ultimately also reject government, but it's the only radical movement which wants to get rid of the government right now. Freedom now is an anarchistic slogan, to abolish the state. The anarchists see the state and the church as the twin evils of oppression in modern society. In addition to opposing the state and wanting to abolish or do away with the state, all anarchists believe in a decentralized form of society. They saw the great trends of the 19th, 20th century seem to be, at least superficially, towards more and more centralization, great hierarchies, where the individual was losing his sense of individuality and his power to the state, both economic and political. So the anarchists were individualists, they were federalists in advocating a loose-knit, decentralized society. They were anti-statists, they were anti-militarists, passionately against warfare, preaching love and brotherhood rather than hatred and war.
Well, most of the people who founded the Freie Arbeitsstimme were active in the Freie Arbeitsstimme and supported it continuously until the very end, were people of the needle trades. The same people who were also active in organizing the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, the Millinery Workers, the Pocket Workers, the Furrier Workers. They were all people that worked with the needle.
Wait a minute. Yes. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Jetzt auf Tafel zusammen. Was soll? Also, Moishe nie groß. Bist mir geworden, ob du da größer Mensch bist du geworden. Also, a Juni-Schab bist du, ha? A Juni-Schab. No, nicht bei mir. Nicht bei Onkel Moses. Bei mir arbeiten nicht die Juni-Leute, bei mir arbeiten Landleute. Und die alle, was arbeiten, nur das nicht genau, aber tun wir eine Sprache. Ah, ja, eine Sprache. Wer hat was in Amerika wäre?
Onkel Martin!
Ja. Zwei kommt ihr mit Trouble, zwei kommt ihr...
Zwei kommt ihr mit Trouble, zwei kommt ihr. Der Onkel macht Kassen in der Pächter macht. Besucht für Appendicitis Apparatus, was
Also, noch Appendicitis, im Fall Lingen und Sending, was soll doch ne?
In der Riemenarbeit mit 40 Schwarzug, für 1370 Schmaleis am Hoch, bei Onkel Martin. Achille wird er grüßen. Achille! In zeirele Weise wird er nur gehen. Am Mulle wird er machen, ihr Schlappen, was Skinne. Dorten, wo wir getanzt auf der Katzene, in Dorten wird vergissen Wein gemischt mit Eierblit.
Nehmen wir mit. Sam, gib noch eine Sache aus, da waren wir da gehen.
Das ist euer Geld und das ist euer Job. Ich will auf euer Katzene nicht tanzen, Onkel Moses. Ich will nicht tanzen. Ihr werdet noch helfen mir, Onkel Moses. Ihr werdet noch helfen mir. Alle werden noch helfen.
The general struggle was to make a union shop and to make union hours. Now we worked, when I came up to the shop, we worked Saturdays and we worked the 9 hours a day. We worked very hard, you know. It wasn't as freedom as it is later on. But the anarchists didn't like their behavior, their action in the union. They wanted more freedom in the union. They wanted that should elect people from the shops. And naturally it was as usual. I don't know whether you're acquainted with unions, but there's a machine and they elect whomever is that they feel like. He happened to get in because we were very active and the workers voted for us.
I think they made a constructive contribution to the union, especially in the beginning, where it was a question of a good deal of self-sacrifice. I think many of the radicals, you know, were, in those days were ready to sacrifice their time, their energy, their health for the activists in the union. To go out and picket at any time during the day or night was a duty and a responsibility that was readily accepted and carried out. There was no problem of getting people when it came especially to the anarchists, the socialists, and the radicals, you know, to go. They showed an example to all the others. They were the first ones on the line.
What were you doing? What were some of your activities within the movement?
Well, what shall I say? I started off as a kid, young fella. Got into Syracuse, New York, and a strike broke out spontaneously, Little Falls, New York. And Italian comrades there asked me to go down there and lead the strike. I led the strike down there for several weeks. Surrounded many times by gunmen at night in the halls. That time pickets didn't have liberties like they had today. And I conducted that strike until Bill Haywood came down from Patterson, took over. There I left Chicago. Just prior to that, I'd been involved in a strike of Rochester, New York. The clothing cutters, I lost my job. That's why I had to go to Utica. Then Utica involved in the Little Falls strike, so I had to leave there. So I came to Chicago. And I tried to get a job in Chicago and couldn't get a job because the association had me blacklisted. So I went down to St. Louis and tried to get a job, couldn't get that job. Well, then I got back to Chicago. I got active then in the Amalgamated Union and worked as a clothing cutter. Then during the 1915 strike, I was arrested 39 times.
Je weet verschrijven moet dat sogar. Soll man legen in alle papers, dass wir werden heute Sklaven.
Charlie had hem zo. Der wordt het sterne meeting, dem wird man naar huis lassen. En der wordt het niet wel ticketen, der wird nicht reingenomen werden in der Union. Hoi!
Der Meister Rabbeini hat reingenomen jeden zu Mitzrayim. Haben Sie so genommen, Winterweine haben Sie so genommen. Hat Meister Rabbeini zu dir gesucht. Oi, was willst ihr reden? Seid nicht ein Häschericken jeden. Sie muss glissig gehen zurück am Mitzrayim. Das geht nicht. Aber das eigene sucht ach hat in den geringer Meische Charlie. Was willst ihr reden? Wir hingriert ihr reden. Lasst uns führen den Streik, lasst uns führen, das geht nicht. Weil wir stehen nicht den Kampf, mehr jagt es
No, we had plenty of fights with scabs, but we had a nice way how to hit them with the knee. Myself and Rozmirsky, because, you know, the policeman watches you, and if you hit him with your hands, then he arrests you. So you shouldn't be arrested, so I used to with my knee. The policeman said once to the judge, you know, I was arrested, and it came to the trial. So the judge asked him, what did you do? He says, Your Honor, she hit me. So he gives a look, and I was standing in the pit. So he says, she hit you? She's so small. He says, Your Honor, she jumped up. It was true, I slept. So naturally, you know, those things happen very often, because when you go and take down a shop, you get in a fight. But you don't want the policeman to see you because he's arresting you. So you try to do it your way, the way you can.
How many times are you arrested?
Oh, plenty. But I used to go out from the, you know, the lawyer would bill me out, and I would go back to the picket line. I never seen, I always would go back because I did things, they'd arrest you because you start a fight with them. But the way I fought them, they couldn't see it. So they arrested me because I was in the crowd. So, but they didn't see me actually doing it.
So you were an agitator.
Well, we all tried to do our best.
Wie lang, oh, wie lang werdet ihr bleiben, noch schlafen und drogen, wie schändlich kennt? Wie lang werdet ihr Grenzen erreicht, immer schaffen, bei dem, was bereut, ihr Bräut? Wie lang werdet ihr Grenzen erreicht, immer schaffen, bei dem, was bereut, ihr Bräut? Wie lang werdet ihr stehen, ihr roten Gebäuden, der niedrig, heimlos verschwand? Es doch schon verkäuft, hätten da ihre Augen, der kennt ihr eiserne Macht. Es doch schon verkäuft, hätten da ihre Augen, der kennt ihr eiserne Macht.
It was teeming at that time. There were all kinds of activities. There were the literary cafes where writers, Jewish writers, used to get together. There was the theatrical cafe. That was the Cafe Royale on 12th Street and 2nd Avenue. You know, where the theatrical people used to get together. Then there was the cafe where rank and file used to go to, like the cafe on 2nd Avenue and St. Mark's Place. There was a waiter by the name of Charlie. He was the nerve center for all the communication nerve center for all the messages and whatever we needed. See, we leave word with Charlie. And spend hours, have a cup of coffee there and spend hours, you know, kibitzing and discussing and trying to solve the problems of the world, see.
If we take the trouble to look at what we call the lexicon of Yiddish literature, which is an 8 or 9 volume work, we'll notice that the most famous Yiddish writers will have a notation that they started their debuts were on the pages of the Freie Arbeiterstimme. And this was not just a coincidence, it was a pattern. It happened. Every budding writer, poet, dramatist, short storyteller knew that if he shows any signs of talent, it will be recognized by the then editor Saul Janowski, who had an uncanny feeling to recognize who has in him something and who is just a dilettante. And he would have in each issue of the Freie Arbeiterstimme a special column where he would answer, and he would tell the guys, you better go back to shoemaking, or you become a street, your talent shows that you're going to be a good street cleaner, something like this. But on the other hand, if he discovers something, he printed it, and he encouraged the fellow.
Geh sich, stiller Drimmel, bist kein Heilung für mein Schmerz, bist kein Entfer auf das Rufen, auf das Suchen von mein Herz. In der Schönheit such ich Sturm, in dem Sturm such ich Ruhe, auf dem Busen von dem Sturm mach ich meine Augen zu.
Giving out leaflets, that's all we knew. There was a man by the name Marcus. I don't know if you heard of him. He was the craziest vegetarian. He only lived on nuts and raisins. That's it. And he was wearing rubber shoes. And he was the craziest anarchist we ever had. He was the one that used to write. But the whole work was, for us, was giving out literature. We were going to lectures. There was an awful lot of doings at that time. Labor Temple, 40th Street was a very busy place. And Goldman used to lecture there. Beukman used to be there. Whoever was in Durant, William Durant, he used to lecture there. Everybody used to lecture there. That was a beautiful place. We used Friday night. Out we got to the lecture. It was never a Friday night that we didn't go to hear a lecture. Saturday night we had a dance. But that was when we were in your age. At this point, we don't need a dance.
I mean, life wasn't all dull for these anarchists. It wasn't all the sweatshop, although many hours of their day were spent working. They had their evenings. The amazing thing is they had enough energy in the evening to attend lectures. And for the one day that they were free from their jobs, they would go on an anarchist picnic, or they would go to an anarchist dance. The sorts of dance they had were the Bauernbau. Bauernbau means the peasant dance, where they would all dress up as peasants and apples would hang from the ceiling and they'd try to bite into them, and they would hold raffles to raise money for the cause. The Arrestantenbäller, the Bauernbäller, these are the arrested balls, the peasant balls, which were held to raise funds for the prisoners under the Tsar. And they sent large sums of money. These working people who would have to save pennies to contribute to the movement and to subscribe to their newspapers would send substantial sums of money to Tsarist Russia through the anarchist Red Cross. They founded an anarchist Red Cross in the years before the First World War. So I say it was a whole world. In the 1960s and 1970s, we heard a great deal about the libertarian counterculture, which was counterposed to the American culture of statism, of militarism. Well, this had already evolved in the 1880s, 90s, and in the decades before the First World War.
I'd like to welcome all of you to the 7th annual reunion of the Friends of the Ferrer Modern School. We've got a pretty good program set up for this afternoon.
This is a reunion of the Ferrer School. It's our 7th one, and about 100 to 200 of us come together every year, and there are very warm refreshments of our memories and of our friendships as we gather this way. No one has lost any interest in coming each year.
What was the Ferrer School? Was it an anarchist experiment or an educational experience? Or?
The Ferrer School was an anarchist experimental school, inspired by the work that Francisco Ferrer had been doing in Spain until he was martyred. And anarchists in America and in many countries organized such free schools where the children went to school and did not have to do anything that was set out by a teacher, but did the things they wanted to do.
The school as it was run, and it was run differently, often at different times throughout the years that it was in existence, but the period that I remember, there was a great attempt to keep apart politics and religion and everything else from the school. The school was run by the kids, more or less, with the adults. It was they had a common meeting, and we ran the school. You didn't have the kind of generation gap which we've seen in recent years, because there was nobody you were fighting against, in effect. The teachers were there, and they usually were called by their first name, and they were one of us all. You weren't forced to go to classes. You weren't forced to have marks or anything else. You could decide what you wanted to do, so that the authority came from not only yourself, but the whole student and school community.
The idea was that if children were removed from a regimented and demanding society which deformed them and put into a free ambiance, they would develop naturally, and they would naturally learn as long as there was any opportunity to learn. Of course, living was learning, and learning was something that children naturally did.
Now, for most people who've heard of the term anarchism, it's almost a synonym for terrorist. The anarchist is a wild-eyed, wild-haired person with a black cape, with a dagger in one hand, a bomb sputtering already in the other. Well, it is true that there was a terrorist element in the anarchist movement. A small minority, the vast majority of anarchists were very gentle and very idealistic people, and in fact frowned upon unmotivated terrorism and violence. The socialists would have nothing to do with this sort of thing, and they rejected terrorism altogether, whereas the anarchists tended at least to defend the terrorists even when they didn't agree with them. Incidentally, I don't want to go to the other extreme to deny that there were any terrorists among the anarchists. What I'm emphasizing is it was a small minority. That is, there were a handful of individuals who carried out terrorist acts, a small segment of the movement who supported them. A fairly large segment sympathized with these terrorists whom they saw as avengers and deliverers, you see. People who were doing propaganda not by the word, as in the Freiarbeit Stimme, but by the deed, to inspire people to act and to make a revolution.
In alle Klassen, wo man geht, hört man Sabastowkes. Jinglach, Mädlach, Kind und Cage, wo sind vom Pribowkes?
Jinglach, Mädlach, Kind und Cage, wo sind vom Pribowkes? Genug schon wieder Horven, genug schon Borgenleien. Macht das Sabastowke, lo mir Brüder sich befreien. Macht das Sabastowke, lo mir Brüder sich befreien. Brüder und Schwester, lo mir zerknöpfen die Hände. Lo mir Nikolai, kallen zerbrechen die Wände. Hey, hey, da loi, Polizei, da loi, sagen wir Charles, was hey. Hey, Schwester, lo mir gehen zusammen. Lo mir Nikolai kennen, begraben mit der Manne. Hey, hey, da neue Polizei, da neue Sache der Scham jetzt. Brasse!
Nächten hat geführt, hat weggelemist. Heute ist geworden, ein Kapitalist.
Hey, hey, da neue Polizei, da neue Sache der Scham jetzt. Brasse!
In 1919, when the Communist Party started in the United States, it was a terrible blow to the Yiddish anarchists and to the readers of the Freie Arbeiterstimme. What happened is this: just as in Soviet Russia, the communists used anarchist slogans. When, for instance, Lenin promulgated the slogan of the factory to the workers, the land to the peasants, all power to the Soviets, this is pure and simple anarchism. Remember, he never mentioned in all these three slogans not the state, not the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, when the anarchists listened to these slogans, they were attracted to them. So here in the United States, just as as in Russia, anarchists worked with the Bolsheviks at the very beginning. But here, an interesting thing happened. Yanovsky, that clear-headed guy, said the Bolsheviks will never introduce these slogans, will never practice what they preach. This is just a lie. It's not true. They're not going to give all the power to the Soviets. They're not going to give the factories to the workers. They're not going to give the land to the peasants. Everything will belong to the state. And he was against joining the Bolsheviks, against joining the communists here, and many of the young anarchists, most of the young anarchists, the most active, broke away from the Yiddish anarchists, broke away from the Freie Arbeiterstimme and weakened it, and they formed the backbone of the Communist Party in the United States.
Ich bring euch a Gries in the trenches. Ich bring euch a Gries in the boys. Wir kämpfen mit Mut, mit Courage und mit Blut. Und wenn die Deutschen lachen, sie sich boys. Ich bring euch a Gries in the Sammies. Das ist der Gries, du sollten sei. Weil wir seine Scheune rennen müssen, wir die Schlacht gewinnen. In der Gries von Uncle Sam's Armee. Ich bring euch a Gries in the trenches. Ich bring euch a Gries in the boys. Sie kämpfen mit Mut, mit Courage und mit Blut. Und wenn die Deutschen lachen, sie sich heus. Ich bring euch a Gries in the Sammies. Das ist der Gries, du sollten sei. Wenn wir seine Scheune rennen müssen, wir die Schlacht gewinnen, ist der Gries von Uncle Sam's Armee.
With the war, a tremendous hysteria seized the country. The atmosphere was terrible. They hated the Germans, so in the city here, you couldn't say, I want a pound of a can of sauerkraut. You didn't buy sauerkraut. You bought Liberty cabbage. The mayor, a bastard if ever there was one, he said, all signs must not use red paint because we don't want them reds around. You wouldn't even have the color. No red was to be in any of the colors of flags or anything in a school or anything else. Mobs and mobs of people chased the anarchists. The Attorney General was a man named Palmer. And the raids were made against all radical halls and homes of individuals. And they'd get into a place and they'd wreck the office. They'd break the machines. They would arrest people on no charges at all, let them out, then arrest them again.
Actually, the Palmer raids were the tail end of this. It all begins during the war itself, where the anarchists were, for the most part, what they called internationalists. They refused to take sides in the war. They were against war. They considered it to be a capitalist struggle where the working man was used as cannon fodder for the purposes of imperialism and the spread of their own local interests, business interests. And the anarchists, of course, refused to fight. Many of them were pacifists by conviction. Others would not take up arms for any government. Not only did they refuse to fight, they agitated against conscription when conscription was introduced in this country. America entered the war in April of 1917. Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman and many of the people associated with the Freiheitliche Stimme conducted rallies and made speeches trying to discourage people from registering for the draft. And eventually they were prosecuted. There was several laws that passed during the First World War. Espionage Act was one of them, for example, under which many anarchists and wobblies and militant socialists were tried and eventually convicted, sent to prison, and then ultimately deported. In one boatload alone on the Buford in December of 1919, the cargo contained 250 anarchists who were being shipped back to Russia, including Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman.
Well, let's be honest about it. Most of our friends got underground. In other words, the thing became so that everybody was being arrested, and people, if they could possibly lay low, they laid low. No question about it. Laid low. Everybody, in fact, I was arrested during the war at the picnic of the Workers' Institute. That time I made an anti-war speech. I was arrested and thrown into jail. I was in jail from Sunday until Thursday. I was taken for the commissioner Thursday, and the commissioner happened to be a man named Schlottfield, a German, who I think his sympathies may have been a little bit the other way. I was taken to the commissioner. He said to me, "That was a picnic? You were drinking? You had a lot of liquor in you?" So I said, "I was drunk." He said, "You wouldn't say it if you're sober, would you?" Discharged. Otherwise, I'd been in jail for years.
When the raids were over, they began to look for individuals. And apparently they had my name on the list. But I understood that they were coming to look for people there, that they're not just going to let me go for nothing. So I didn't go home. But they went to my house, and they came into the room. I had a room with people there. When they came in, the people let them in, so they looked over the literature, and they saw my books were all on anarchism. And they were looking for something to get to recognize me. But after they didn't find anything there. They looked at the wall, they saw a painting hanging. So they asked the people whose painting it is, so they said, "That's mine." And they took all that painting and they hung it up in the police station. And 20 years later, I came in with Nelson. We were arrested and brought into that precinct. And Nelson says to me, "Give a kick." And I looked up and there was my painting hanging. 20 years after that.
You know there was a guy named Moses.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, he had a brother. And that brother's name was the name that I carried.
Aaron?
That's right. Yeah, I had it in Yiddish, you see. That's the way it's spelled in Hebrew.
Selma and I did not marry until a few years ago.
Why didn't you marry?
I guess because we are anarchists, and we didn't regard a marriage by either by a clerical group or by the state as necessary for our marriage, for our living together. However, as we reached the age of retirement and Social Security, I had heard the stories of other anarchists, of the great difficulties they had to establish their right to Social Security when they were not married. And I thought it would be better to avoid this difficulty and get legally married. I went there with my daughter and her children, and my grandchildren were the witnesses to the marriage that we had. Lynn and Gerald were about 3 or 4 years younger, or 5 years younger, and they were our witnesses. Do you remember the marriage we had?
Yeah.
One of the most important reasons for the decline of the Jewish anarchist movement and of the whole old immigrant movement, which saw its height from 1880 to 1920, was that they were dying out. and the number of Yiddish readers was dying out in general. As I say, anarchism for them was part of their immigrant experience, that their revulsion against America, in which they couldn't find a place, a comfortable place. They couldn't speak the language. They were being forced to work for small wages in sweatshops, long hours, and so on, so that they rebelled and reacted against this and became radicals and joined the anarchist movement. But times had changed even there. They were collecting Social Security checks. They were receiving higher wages. They had bought themselves homes and automobiles, and they were living a pretty much, in many cases, a middle-class existence. And their children were not carrying the torch of anarchism. The children were American-born. They faced none of the problems that the immigrants faced in terms of culture, alienation, language, exploitation, oppression. They lived rather comfortably. They spoke English. They were native-born. They went to school here. In many cases, they became professionals. They went to law school and medical school. They were assimilated very rapidly. It was very difficult for the old generation to be assimilated.
So now you've been an anarchist all these years, and what about your children or your grandchildren? Are any of them anarchists?
No, you see, they don't now. For instance, my son, he believes in every tier of the anarchists, but he says he wouldn't belong to any group or any, there is none where he lives. And so they pass their life away without being active. He would come, he used to come to the Feierabendschim. If he do something, he would help out, but none of them.
Do you feel that they're really missing something important?
Personally, yes, I would like them to. But you see, anarchist movement is not a movement that you have a say, or like the communists, you impose things of your ideas. We don't. We can talk to them, agitated, but we don't impose. So you do as you please. And the same thing was with the kids. They know that I'm an anarchist, and they really respect me and everything. And they'll go with me when I'll ask them, or they'll give me money when I need for the movement. But they themselves, he says, I don't want to call myself an anarchist because I'm not doing anything.
Well, my grandfather was Joseph Cohen. He was an anarchist leader, and as much as an anarchist can have a leader. And he was, about 50 years ago, he was the editor of the Freie Arbeiter Stimme for several years. And I guess he's the person in our family, in my family's history, that I know the most about. Everyone in the family has always been very proud of him and what he did. And so my father's always been taking great pains to explain to me what an anarchist was from the time when I was a very little boy. Your grandfather was an anarchist. He was a philosophical anarchist. He believed that people should live together in peace, and he didn't throw bombs. And that's always irritated my father tremendously, that people thought that all anarchists were bomb throwers and never bothered to learn what the ideas of Kropotkin or any of the other anarchists were.
A Welt, wo keiner wird nicht regieren über dem anderens Arbeit und Mie. Frei wird sein jedes Herz und Gehirn. Das ist Anarchie. A Welt, wo Freiheit wird jeden beglicken, dem Schwachen und Starken, dem Er und Sie. Wo deins und meins wird keinem nicht drücken. Das ist Anarchie.
Look at me.
Do you recognize?
Oh, yes.
Was she good looking in those years?
This is Molly Steimer, right?
Yeah. Molly and Fanny Ressler. Pass them on.
It's the only pictures Molly has of me. I think.
How does your anarchism apply to your life today?
Well, today, very, very little. But it is this small group, and I'm sure, in case of need, one for the other. We wouldn't hesitate or stop at any time.
That's what Kropotkin called mutual aid.
And within our means of physically and financially. And we've been doing it.
So anarchism is not just a theory, it's something that you have to apply it as an ethic. It's an ethic that you...
I know personally, I can say, and I really lived anarchism. And I feel that anarchism, you have to live, not only preach it and talk about it, you have to give an example of yourself.
You know, when two Jews get together, there's always a third question, 3 questions. And the same with the anarchists. Law and order among ourselves could be better organized, but the worth sentiments of each other, you don't get. At least I didn't get it in all my years anywhere else.
Henry Ibsen, in 1870, writing a letter to Georg Brandes, said, "Tie yourself to a star and sail with it." Every person must have a star, an ideal to which he clings. The ideal may not be realized today or tomorrow, but you must have an ideal which will carry you forward in life, will inspire you to do deeds and acts. We are living in a society, we have made economic progress, we may have made here some slight progress, but ultimately we are living in a society with our slaves, poverty, misunderstanding, social injustice, all the wrongs of society. And there are people foolish like myself and many others, call ourselves anarchists, who feel that this injustice can be done away with, that people can be educated. We must in our soul believe that justice must prevail. We must have that concept that we are going to carry on little by little. You see, the trouble is when you get people into a movement and they see the revolution over tomorrow, and it doesn't come tomorrow, they become disillusioned. They were never revolutionaries. They never had a concept, a true understanding. If the understanding, no matter what happens, you will carry on that ideal. You feel that justice must prevail. The concept of justice, moral certainty, that right is right. It is the doctrine that no matter what you call it, anarchist syndicalist, anarchist individualist, anarchist communist, whatever label you put to it, what is the ultimate goal of all these scattered ideas? Whether it's the idea of Proudhon, whether it's Kropotkin, whether it's Malatesta or anyone else. Each one had little variations. But the ultimate ideal, the ultimate concept of all of these people was ultimate human justice for everybody. And that is the ideal that anarchism stands for.
Der schreckt sich unhot Meure, will mit uns in Kampf nicht gehen. Jener ist a schlaff geboren, jener ist a schlaff geboren und soll bleiben in der Heim. Jener ist a schlaff geboren, jener ist a schlaff geboren und soll bleiben in der Heim. Vorwärts Friede in die Reihen, die Plakaten trot vor Reus. Macht es gehen, 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 macht es gehen, 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 in den Kampf zu sehen.